Congressman from Arizona's 5th Congressional District. We're glad that you're here, and I thank my colleagues who are joining me today. We're here about a very important and, in fact, even an existential crisis for America. I extend my gratitude to Mr. McCarthy, Speaker McCarthy, for two things. Number one, he has kept his promise in opening up the appropriations process and making it more vigorous and more participatory than it has been in the past. And so, to that end, everyone up here has been working to try to improve our fiscal situation. The second thing I would say is his letter to President Biden this morning, I think, is a positive move, and it gets to certainly a fundamental foundation of why we are here today, and that is to reiterate the House Freedom Caucus plan, but also to, if I can use these words, revise and extend it just a little bit. So we stand here today with a $31.4 trillion national debt, and every month our debt increases by at least $100 billion. In other words, we spend every month $100 billion more than we bring in revenue. And in so doing, we weaken our fiscal situation, we increase inflation, and we cause additional problems going forward for this nation. And here's a way to think about it. In 2015, we had a debt limit of $18 trillion. In 2019, it was $22 trillion. In 21, it went to $28.5 trillion, and then in 2021, again, we extended it to $31.4 trillion, which is we're up on that today. We're now being asked to raise the debt ceiling another $4 trillion over the next 2 years. And if you follow the Biden administration's budget wish list, that would take it to $50 billion by 2033. And several weeks ago, the House Freedom Caucus put out a plan to try to address the debt ceiling and then also to address our profligate federal spending. Much of that has been adopted by Speaker McCarthy in his letter to President Biden, and that's why I was offering him gratitude earlier. First of all, we said you have to revoke President Biden's unconstitutional and ill-conceived forgiveness of student loans. The HFC scored it at $400 billion, but when you actually not just get to the forgiveness portion, but you get into the reworking, it's a total savings of about $609 billion. When you rescind unspent COVID-19 funds, that's at least another $100 billion. When you eliminate subsidies and tax credits for outrageous and unproven Green New Deal projects, that is scored as $350 billion that you can rescind and claw back. We've already voted out of the House a rescission of $80 billion of the IRS funding. When you cap non-defense discretionary spending at 2022 levels, you save an additional $130 billion. The total savings of the HFC plan was $3 trillion over 10 years, but at current spending rates, or I shouldn't say current spending rates, but at rates that will continue on because we will continue to spend higher than our revenue every month. Over the course of 10 years, your net will still be a deficit, an additional adding to your national debt of somewhere north of $10 trillion. So we urge immediate action, and I hope that's where our conference continues to go. Recovering unspent COVID money, recouping the money for subsidies and tax credits for outrageous and unproven Green New Deal projects, and the IRS funds that double that agency. Those alone total $500 billion. Now, why do we bring this up? Because if you can move the necessity of raising and lifting your debt ceiling level, and you can push that off past the current fiscal year, the end of the current fiscal year, that would allow us to then implement cost-saving measures that would forestall the need to raise the debt ceiling. Then we can recover additional dollars from the Biden's unconstitutional ill-conceived student loan forgiveness and restructuring plan, currently scored at $609 billion. We should immediately also ascertain how much of COVID relief and other federal dollars are in the treasuries of the several states and are unusable right now. They just sit there because the states have restrictions on them. They can't use them because of the restrictions we gave them. We should then allow that money to be used in ways that are normally funded by the federal government, thus obviating the need for new federal money, certainly in fiscal year 2024, because they would have money already there. Finally, with the postponement of the debt ceiling deadline artificially imposed by Secretary Yellen, we could consider a budget that reflects the reality of our fiscal crisis. And this gets to what I was thanking Mr. McCarthy, Speaker McCarthy, for earlier. To my left is 507 pieces of legislation that reflect reductions in spending. The way we did that is my staff, and I thank my staff, Zach and Scott and Matt, who worked diligently, long hours putting this together. And we submitted these requests to the Appropriations Committee, and now also have these in legislative form. These bills, together with others that my colleagues behind me have worked on, would reflect additional billions and billions of dollars in savings, which would add to the overall net reduction in our national debt, or reduction in the acceleration of the national debt, that's for sure. And I encourage you to, as you read those, understand we had to go through and get line items because we couldn't receive the line items. We should be doing a line item budget. We should be doing a zero-based budget. That would allow us to make reductions specifically where they need to go. Well, we didn't have that, so we had to use previous budgets and go from there. And that's what we have. And every one of these probably has 6 to 10, 12, sometimes more lines underneath it that need to be evaluated as well. Our work isn't done. And so I appreciate the support of our conference and hearing Mr. McCarthy. I appreciate his support for our plan. And I'm grateful for my colleagues here who all are working on this and trying to extend the HFC plan to make sure that we get on a fiscal path that allows the United States to continue with economic and fiscal growth now and in the future. I recognize now my friend from South Carolina, Mr. Ralph Norman.
Andy, I want to thank you for bringing to light what we're doing. You know, everywhere we go, people ask me, what are you doing? We hadn't seen anything yet. Well, this is what you see. The stacks of paper, 550,
507.
Andy, 507 is direct cuts that we're asking the appropriations to consider. Things like $200 million for Gender Equity and Equality Action Fund. Things like $5 million for studying the impact of culverts, roads, and bridges on salmon populations. Things like $410 million towards border security. Get this, for Jordan, Lebanon, Egypt, Tunisia, and Oman. Things like $3 million for bee-friendly highways. Folks, this is an insult to the taxpayers. This is an insult. And as Congressman Biggs says, we're just beginning. And Kevin McCarthy has done a good job of highlighting this and sending the letters to the president on what he needs to be doing. Do I expect anything out of this administration? No. I didn't expect anything when he submitted his budget, and I was right. He didn't give us anything. But it's a new day in Congress. It's a new day for the American people. And I will tell you this, what my friends in the Freedom Caucus are highlighting is not smoke and mirrors, direct cuts that benefit the American people. And along with that, I want you to be mindful of the interest that goes along with that. As Congressman Biggs says, you know, we're $32 trillion and counting. If you put Social Security, the Highway Fund, and many others, we're deeper in that. But every trillion is $30 billion in interest. Every trillion is $30 billion in interest if you use a 3% rate. You've got to somehow, you can't just pay the principal, you've got to pay the interest too. So that's one of the things that this country, to get economic security, which is national security, it starts right here with these pieces of paper. And I just want to thank the members of everybody standing behind me, because they're not just talking, we're doing something. Now call on my good friend Chip Roy from Texas.
Thanks, Ralph. Thanks, Andy. Thanks for these great friends being here today. And we're really gratified to see the Speaker send a strong message to the President of the United States that it will be the President who chooses to gamble with the possibility of default, not the United States House of Representatives. We are putting forward concrete plans. We're willing to sit down at the table and talk about what we need to do our job, what the American people sent us here to do. They didn't send us here to do more of the same. This is a pretty simple question. Do you think we need more Washington and less growth in America, or do you think we ought to actually shrink Washington and grow America? Because we think it ought to be the latter. We think that the massive bureaucratic state in this town is undermining prosperity and growth, inhibiting freedom, and denying the next generation of Americans their right as an American to inherit a free and prosperous country. That's what we're looking at. It's that simple. What we're putting forward is our concrete ideas to say that we should shrink that bureaucracy so that we can get the regulatory state, the bureaucratic state out of the way of the American people, create the economic growth needed to get us out of the mess that leadership, so-called leadership in this town for the last 2 decades has created. You cannot sustain $32 trillion of debt. You can't. You can't sustain continuing to fund the very bureaucracy that we all campaign against every year. Now look, let's just put this in pretty stark terms. Everybody today is going around saying, hey, this is like 1939 in the world. It's right before World War II. You know, we're facing threats in China. We're facing threats in Russia. We've got threats in our own backyard in the Western Hemisphere with cartels running amok at our border. So the question is, what are you going to do about that? If you believe that to be true, if you believe it to be true that we are facing a moment like 1939, that these threats are real, then how can you possibly take those threats on if you're adopting a 1946 version of America in terms of the amount of debt that we have to the size of our economy? Because that's where we are. And if you're not going to do the things necessary to make sure you've got a strong military, sparingly used, that is focused on doing its job, and that you minimize the bureaucratic state to create the economic growth needed to get us out of this mess. This president is talking about 0.6% economic growth. Like, literally, like, everybody here, is that what you want for yourself, for your kids, your grandkids, 0.6% economic growth? Or do you want the 3.5%, 4.5% kind of growth we had under Reagan and frankly under Clinton when you had a Republican House and they were all working together to figure out how to do their jobs? We're here to say that the time for continuing business as usual in Washington is over. We believe we should shrink Washington and grow America. We should return the bureaucratic spending to pre-COVID levels. We're not asking for anything wild-eyed. We're just simply asking to take that spending back to pre-COVID levels. You let the president come out and say, oh, the wailing and gnashing of teeth about what that means. Do you think the government was really efficient and effective in 2019? You don't think we can survive on the 2019 size of government? Bull. Of course we can. So let's do our job. Let's stand up for the American people. With that, I'll turn it over to my good friend, Mr. Good from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Roy, and thank you for Chairman Biggs, our former House Freedom Caucus chairman, who's still chairman to all of us, for leading this initiative and initiating this press conference today. I'm on the Budget Committee, and I had the opportunity this past week to talk to the Biden budget director, Ms. Shalonda Young, and it's funny to think about the Biden administration if it weren't so sad having a budget director, because the budget director doesn't understand anything about spending, our national debt, or our budget. I asked Director Young if she knew how much the national debt was, and she tried to say it was $24 trillion instead of $32 trillion. I corrected her that it was actually $32 trillion. I asked her if she understood how much that was per American citizen. She had no idea, so I helped her with the math. Again, the budget director, that it was about $100,000 per citizen. I asked her if she knew what the debt to GDP was. She tried to say it was 90-something percent. I said, no, it's about 125%. I asked her, did she know when the last time in our history that it was about 125%? She did not know, so I helped her to recognize that it was 90 years ago, or 80 years ago during World War II. And I asked her what has led to it today versus what led to it 80 years ago. What is the crisis that led to us having this amount of debt? And, of course, she had no answer. And I said, how could we ever handle or absorb a crisis on the level of World War II when we came into it with the same amount of debt to percent to GDP that we exited World War II some 80 years ago. That generation, though, paid off that debt in short order and did not leave it to their children and grandchildren the way that we are threatening to do so today. And so we have this $32 trillion national debt, highest in the history of our country, of course. And what is the president's response? An unprecedented $7 trillion in spending, a budget of $7 trillion. I asked Budget Director Young, I said, do you know how much that equates to for each citizen? Of course she didn't know, so I helped her. That's about $20,000, a little over $20,000 per citizen. And the question is, what are the American people getting? What do they have for that 100,000 share they already have, or the 20,000 that this president per American citizen? And I think most Americans would say, hey, they don't have much to show for their share of this national debt. This effort, as my colleagues have already said, to return to 2019 spending levels. To that point, the most ridiculous, reckless, bloated, excessive federal budget debt situation in the history of the country until President Biden. Who would have known that he would be so good at spending money? Never before in the history of the country, $10 trillion in new spending in the first 2 years of administration. This president who makes Jimmy Carter look competent, who returned us to inflation and misery index levels that go back 40 years. This president who makes Barack Obama look moderate by comparison is trying to ruin the country fiscally. I also add my appreciation to Speaker McCarthy, who has appropriately recognized one of the greatest threats to the country is our debt, is our spending, and our fiscal situation that is so unstable. And we're trying to address that. The conference is united. Speaker McCarthy in this conference is largely saying the same thing, talking about cutting $3 to $4 trillion in spending, going back to 2019 non-defense discretionary spending, 2022 spending overall, and we have put forth as a Freedom Caucus modest proposals, frankly, compared to what our national debt situation is that Chairman Biggs has already talked about, with rescinding the student loan spending, the IRS expansion, the $300 to $400 billion in crazy climate, environmental extremism policies, and so forth. However, there are 1,200 unauthorized programs that we continue to put on autopilot and spend on every year, 1,200 that cost us $500 billion a year on an annual basis, $500 billion. And what Chairman Biggs has led on is these hundreds of specific spending cuts on how we can get back to fiscal stability by making specific cuts to take us back to 2019. The reason why our predecessors passed these huge omnibus spending bills, which will end with this Congress at least in these next 2 years. We will not do that anymore. We have served notice to that effect. But the reason why they packaged together these huge omnibus spending bills, because you can't defend almost any of the spending programs on their own face value, on their own value, on their own warranty. You can't defend borrowing and spending on those programs anymore to the degree that we have. So we are committed to doing what needs to be done to put the country back on a path to fiscal responsibility. Thank you to my colleagues. Thank you to Chairman Biggs. And I now turn to my good friend from Arizona, Eli Crane. Oh, Matt Gaetz from Florida.
The message from House Republicans to President Biden is clear. There will be no increase in the debt limit in the absence of significant and meaningful spending cuts. I am very proud that House Republicans ran against the inflation that has crushed American families. And this, today, represents the most specific detail in our plan to stop that inflation. The American people know that inflation is often induced by excessive government spending. And so we have laid out a plan represented in this body of legislative work that doesn't cut Social Security, that doesn't cut Medicare, but that attacks a woke and weaponized government that the American people should not continue to have to fund at the expense of their own economic security and the economic security of future generations. Inflation is still stubbornly high. Spending is rising. We have banks failing, and we've reached the debt limit. It seems like a perfect time to assess the things that are no longer necessary for us to spend funds on. I am particularly pleased that in this plan, in the messaging from the House Freedom Caucus, and even in Speaker McCarthy's letter to President Biden today, I see reflected my call for work requirements on Medicaid and on a number of the social safety net programs where we have able-bodied, childless adults who could go to work and they choose not to. Well, I don't think hardworking Americans should be paying for all of the social services for people who could make a broader contribution and instead are couch potatoes. So thank you, Chairman Biggs, for this exquisite detail. Thank you to my colleagues for laying out these cuts, and I would turn the mic over to my colleague Eli Crane from Arizona.
Thank you guys for coming today. I'm not going to try and get into the details like some of my colleagues did and just be redundant in that. They did a great job. I'm honored to be here. As a freshman member, I often get asked by my constituents and just other people around the country, what has been the biggest disappointment since you've got up to Washington, D.C.? And there's a lot of them, quite honestly. There's a lot of them. The fact that, a lot of my colleagues campaign and talk about cutting, all the out-of-control spending in Washington, and then we get opportunities to cut it, seem to get a little lighthearted, and sometimes seem to lack the backbone. That's really disappointing, I'll tell you that. But the number one thing that has been the most disappointing to me is to listen to individuals that I've listened to and watched on TV, conservative media talking heads, who talk about this swampy town, who talk about the establishment, who talk about the fact that Republicans never fight or they never do anything. And the moment we do, and you guys saw this in January, the moment we did they have our backs? No, they didn't. Well, it's time for them. We're going to give them an opportunity to redeem themselves, because for a fact you don't make cuts in this town without there being some retribution. You don't make cuts to some of these programs without a lot of crying and gnashing of teeth. That's just not how this town works. I have a feeling that it's going to get intense at some point. And I'm asking Republican, conservative talking heads in the media to actually do the right thing and to help us out, get our backs. You guys see it's concrete right here. We are talking about real cuts, but we need your help, because half of this is messaging to the American people who have jobs, who have kids, who have lives, who are busy. And oftentimes this town and the media here finds a way to spend it to make Republicans and conservatives who are actually trying to be fiscally responsible for our kids and our grandkids boogeymen. And it's nonsense. It's nonsense. And we need your help. So you have a chance, and you know who you are. We know who you are. You have a chance to redeem yourself and help us out so that we can make sure that our kids and our grandkids have a chance at some of the economic opportunities that we grew up with. That's all I have to say. Thank you guys for showing up. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague from Montana, Matt Rosendale.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for showing up today. I'd like to put a couple of things in perspective. Everybody talks about the reductions in spending and what we're doing and where the revenue is. Keep in mind, in 2019, we were collecting $4 trillion in revenue a year. The federal government was $4 trillion in revenue a year. The problem was that the spending was at $5.14 trillion. So we were already running a $1 trillion a year deficit. Fast forward, we get to 22. We're collecting, after the Job Cuts and Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, we actually increased revenue. The Democrats said it could never happen. We increased revenue to $4.9 trillion a year. And as my friend from Texas said, Chip Roy, do you think we didn't have enough government in 2019? $4.9 trillion a year of revenue in 22, we nearly eliminated the deficit. But yet, we increased spending. We're up at $6.27 trillion of spending. And now the president comes out and proposes a nearly $7 trillion a year budget. We cannot sustain that. This is the problem that we continue to face. And not only are we spending more money, it's not just money going out the door like it's an investment. It's money that's going to fund the very tyranny against the American citizens. It's funding programs like $5 million to a foundation that engages in activities such as suing coal miners. It's funding additional regulatory processes that make it difficult for our businesses to open up and to succeed and to thrive instead of just making ends meet. This is the problem with the additional money that we're spending. That's why we have created a list of 507 documents here to reduce that spending. So when the reporters all come out and they say, what do you propose? Please go through the list. Are there some things that folks would like to keep in place? Sure. But I want to tell you something. The fact is that if we continue to spend at the current rates that we are, the economy and the hyperinflation and the problems that's going to go along with that in the global loss of confidence in the U.S. dollar is going to be much worse than the problems that we're experiencing with inflation right here, right now. We start talking about the collapse of the financial system, and it's going to be much worse than reducing a $10 million program to look at worms, in the earth, in biodegradable trash in the landfill somewhere. I mean, these are things that need to be eliminated to make sure that we can sustain the way of life that we have grown accustomed to, and that we want to guarantee and assure for our children and our grandchildren. So that's the kinds of things that we would like that you keep in mind. And thank you so much for coming out today. There's no reason that we can't return to the 2019 spending levels. Again, I agree that we need to shrink Washington and grow America. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Appreciate my colleagues. Appreciate you being here. I just want to add one more thing. I mean, when Representative Crane talked about weeping, wailing, and gnashing of teeth. Every program, everything that we have listed here has a constituency. As soon as you create a program, start spending money, people start you've created a constituency, so people will try to protect that interest at all costs. That's why this is so important. That's why I appreciate the support of my colleagues, and so many in this town don't want to see that, but we wanted to see it. So we have time for a couple of questions. I think I can't see worth a lick because of the lights, but over here I can see you, John.
Congressman, I'm wondering, do you have a sense right now what the deadline is for the budget, for the debt, when it needs to be extended? It seems to be moving, and I'm wondering if you have the latest information on that, when that date might occur.
So Secretary Yellen said June 6th, and then it kind of got pushed back into August. The plan that we've proposed at HFC would actually take, at the bare minimum, would take it past and throw it out past the expiration of the fiscal year. And I'm going to let Mr. Good address that.
Thank you. If I could just add to that, I led a letter with some of my colleagues here to Secretary Yellen several weeks back, asking her, when will we reach the debt limit? What is the specific date when we will reach the debt limit? How are they calculating when we'll reach the debt limit? And what is their plan when we reach the debt limit to ensure the country does not default, the government does not default on its debt? We have not received a satisfactory response with any specific answers. We got a letter back that didn't address any of those specific questions. So I'm not sure Secretary Yellen knows, or at least she's not willing to be forthcoming on that.
I'll just add one thing.
Okay.
Look, the answer's pretty simple. It's whenever she decides, and it'll be at the point when they can inflict the maximum damage to this country by choosing that moment that advantages the White House to be able to spend more money. That's when they'll pull the trigger.
Yeah, and if I can sum up what I think we're all trying to say is, you don't have to raise the debt ceiling if you take some measurements that we're proposing. You don't have to do that, and that's what we're getting at. Yeah. Yes, I can see you up there.
Natalie Andrews from the Wall Street Journal.
Yeah.
Sorry, my voice. How hard is it to get, what leverage does the Freedom Caucus plan on using to drive home getting these cuts? We've seen in previous GOP majorities that the House Freedom Caucus was able to exercise their power. But we've seen in recent years that some Republicans have been willing to vote to raise the debt ceiling as well. So what are your thoughts?
We've seen often Republican colleagues across the aisle to raise the debt ceiling. I just, leaving out the strategy alone, I just say that the fact that Speaker McCarthy wrote a letter to the president iterating many of the components of the House Freedom Caucus original plan to forestall raising the debt ceiling, I think that indicates that that we seem to have a fairly united front, and I'm hoping and praying that it continues to be united and we go forward and I'll just leave it right there. And I guess Matt wants to go.
I would add that discussions about spending levels were a part of the negotiations that allowed Speaker McCarthy to ascend to the speakership, and today's letter from the Speaker to the President represents Speaker McCarthy's fidelity to that agreement.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Yep.
Many of these cuts that you guys are talking about, even if you are able to get widespread agreement within the House GOP and pass this, do you think that it would stand a chance of passing in the Senate?
So we're working. A number of us are working with senators trying to get support for some of these ideas. I will just tell you, I'm really loath to handicap us as we try to get something meaningful done simply because we think that the Senate might not act or be against it. Our job, we can't control what the Senate does. Our job is to put out the very best product we can put out, and that's what I'm focusing on. I hope my colleagues want to add to that. Yeah, Ralph.
Let me just tell you what's encouraging. We've had our last meeting was with senators. We had senators who took their time to come over. They're as anxious to have something in writing like what's here so that they can make the Senate vote on it. And we'll see what happens. But, we're in the House. All our cards are in the House. We represent we control the money strings, and that's what we're going to use. And we'll see. But at least we're putting it forward, and we're doing it on a timely basis.
You said one thing, Andy. Yeah. So, as a former staffer in the Senate, and a bit of a creature of it when I was Senator Cruz's chief of staff about a decade ago, look, the issue is get something over there to the Senate, right? Get something over there to the Senate and make them chew on it. Make those senators have to go look at the American people straight in the eye and say they're not going to do the responsible job that the American people sent them here to do. The Senate has to answer if we do our job and send a responsible plan over to the U.S. Senate. Our job here isn't to sort of handicap that out. Our job is to send something over that the American people want us to, make the Senate then respond. We used to do that in this town. Ping pong things back and forth. Let's get on with it. Let's do our job. And I think that's the first step that the Speaker took today. And one other point, this great stack of material here, this is a roadmap on things that we can go cut, that the American people want us to go cut. But also remember that what we're talking about here is an across-the-board top-line return to some sort of normalcy as a step forward to fiscal sanity, right? You got to look at the entire bureaucracy. That's just a piece of the puzzle. That doesn't add up to everything that needs to happen. We're just saying return that top-line number to pre-COVID levels. Again, every American that I've said that to says yes. Every single one of them has said yes, that makes sense.
Deregulation or reforms. Is your position that it has to be spending cuts plus that, or could you do a debt ceiling energy reform bill only?
Well, we would like to see other policies as well. We've mentioned some of those in the past. The REINS Act, for instance, which we think is a very important policy. And so we're putting this out. We're willing to sit down at the table and be part of it. And I think, as Mr. Gates said, we are part of it, and which has been, quite frankly, something we've not seen in the past. That the whole conference is actually engaged, and so we're grateful for that. But I would say things like the REINS Act and other policies that go with that are part of our package that we actually put out several weeks ago.
Will this list be made available to reporters?
Yeah, we're going to be filing this on the floor today. You guys all signing on, right, as co-sponsor? Okay. Sure. Didn't want to make sure I wasn't the only guy on all those bills. But anyway, we'll be filing it today, and then it'll be available. Yeah.
Can you quickly run through the numbers again on how much spending cuts are?
This package alone exceeds $1 billion. I don't mean $1 billion. Heavens, yeah, a trillion, 1,000 billions. So this is all discretionary. Discretionary, non-defense. So, with that, thank you very much. Appreciate you being here today.
Thank you.
Good job. And this, hey, you guys, I just need you to sign the co-sponsor.
Hey, Andy, you've got me on all this stuff, don't you? I told you to sign on everything.
Yeah, I told my guys, but they want the six. They want the
ink is a lot stronger than the strong. The weakest of ink is stronger than the strongest of words. So please remember that.
I'd like, you need to say that twice. I don't think you could say that twice.
Famous of being more powerful than the strongest of words.